Cactus Arm, Arizona. In 1982, David Grunman drove out into the Sonoran Desert near Lake Pleasant, Arizona, with a 12-gauge shotgun and chose a target that would kill him. Lake Pleasant sits roughly 30 miles northwest of Phoenix, in a stretch of desert that looks to the uninitiated like empty land. It is not empty. The Sonoran Desert is one of the most biologically dense arid ecosystems in North America, and its most iconic resident is the saguaro cactus, a plant that takes a century to reach its full height and can weigh several tons when fully hydrated. A saguaro does not even begin growing its first arm until it is approximately 75 years old, which means a 26-foot specimen represents nearly a full human lifetime of slow, patient growth in one of the harshest climates in North America. The saguaro is a protected species under Arizona state law. It is illegal to damage, destroy, or remove one. These facts were apparently not persuasive to Grunman. The saguaro he selected that day stood 26 feet tall. From a distance, it would have looked like what it always looks like, a pale green column, ribbed and spined, with one or more thick arms extending outward from the main trunk. To a person treating it as a target, it would have seemed massive, stationary, and entirely passive. It was not going anywhere. It could not fight back. It was, in every visible sense, just a very large plant standing in the sun. Saguaros do not look dangerous. That is the relevant fact. Their arms, which can extend 4 feet or more in length, are dense with water-storing tissue. The saguaro uses its corrugated exterior to expand when rain is available, storing hundreds of gallons of water to sustain itself through dry seasons. This water content makes the cactus extraordinarily heavy. A single arm of the type Grunman was about to target weighed approximately 500 pounds. He began shooting. The 12-gauge shotgun delivered repeated blasts into the body of the cactus. Each shot tore into the fibrous, water-dense interior of the plant. Saguaro tissue does not shatter like wood. It absorbs and tears. The rounds punch through the outer skin and into the pulpy core, disrupting the structural network that held the arm in place at the joint where it met the main trunk. The arm held through the first shots. It held through several more. Then the structural integrity of the joint failed. The arm, 4 feet long and weighing approximately 500 pounds, separated from the trunk. It did not fall outward. It did not topple sideways. It dropped almost directly downward, following the line that gravity demanded, which was the line directly toward David Grunman standing below it. The arm struck him, a 500-pound object, falling from the height of the junction point of a 26-foot cactus, delivers an enormous amount of force on impact. The desert floor offered no cushion. There was no margin. Emergency responders were called to the scene. The desert terrain near Lake Pleasant is not easily accessible, and response times in remote areas of Maricopa County in 1982 were not rapid. What responders found when they arrived was not a survival situation. The injuries inflicted by the falling arm were severe. Nothing that could be done in the field or in transport would have changed the outcome. David Grunman was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was crush injuries sustained when a saguaro cactus arm he had severed with shotgun fire fell onto him. He had traveled into protected desert land to shoot a state-protected cactus for recreational purposes, and the cactus had returned the favor in the only way physics would allow. In the years since, the incident has become a recurring reference point in Arizona conservation education, cited in ranger training and desert safety literature as an example of how casually people can misjudge the mass and structural behavior of a plant they assume is inert. Revolver as phone. In 1992, 47-year-old Ken Charles Barger was killed in his own bedroom in North Carolina by a loaded handgun he mistook for a telephone. Barger was a middle-aged man living an ordinary life. The bedroom he slept in was arranged the way many people arrange theirs, with a nightstand beside the bed holding the items most likely to be needed in the night. For Barger, those items included a telephone and a loaded .38 special revolver. Both sat within arm's reach of where he slept. In the dark, at a distance navigated entirely by habit and touch, they occupied the same general territory on that nightstand surface. The .38 special is a common revolver caliber, with a long history in American civilian and law enforcement use. The revolver itself, as a platform, is a straightforward mechanism. It does not require a safety to be disengaged in most configurations. It fires when the trigger is pulled. A loaded .38 special revolver sitting on a nightstand is a firearm in a state of immediate readiness. The telephone rang sometime during the night. Being awakened from sleep by a ringing phone is a disorienting experience under ordinary circumstances. The brain does not transition smoothly from deep sleep to full wakefulness. It moves through stages, and in the first seconds of being pulled out of sleep by a sudden sound, a person operates on reflex and habit rather than conscious decision. The hand moves toward the sound before the mind has fully formed a plan. Sleep researchers describe this transitional state as sleep inertia, a period during which coordination, judgment, and basic sensory discrimination are all measurably impaired, sometimes for several minutes after waking. Barger reached toward his nightstand in the dark. His hand found the revolver. The shape of a revolver grip and the shape of a telephone handset are not the same. But in the dark, reached for reflexively, the distinction did not register. He picked up the revolver. He raised it to his ear, the way a person raises a phone receiver. And he pulled the trigger, the way a person might press a button to answer a call. The .38 Special discharged directly into his head. The sound of the shot would have been audible to anyone in proximity. What followed was the response that follows any such call placed to emergency services in the middle of the night in a residential area. Responders arrived at the home. They found Barger in his bedroom. The wound from a .38 Special fired at contact range against the head is not a wound that allows for intervention. The nature of the injury was immediately apparent to anyone who arrived on scene. There was nothing to be done. Ken Charles Barger was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, ruled accidental. The loaded revolver had been within reach because he wanted it accessible. It was accessible. That was the entire problem. Firearms safety instructors have since cited the case as a textbook argument for keeping any bedside weapon in a fixed, distinctly shaped holster or lockbox, rather than loose on an open surface. Precisely so that touch alone, in the dark, in that first disorient moment of waking, cannot mistake one object for another. Encyclopedia bullet test. On a day in 2017, 22-year-old Pedro Ruiz III was shot and killed in Minnesota while his girlfriend filmed the moment for a YouTube video he believed would make them famous. Pedro Ruiz III was 22 years old and living in Minnesota with his girlfriend, Mona Lisa Perez. In 2017, YouTube was several years into its phase as a platform where ordinary people could accumulate audiences of millions by producing content that was, above all else, attention-grabbing. Stunt content was a significant portion of what drove views. The more dangerous the stunt appeared, the more likely it was to circulate. Ruiz understood this. He had a plan. The couple had already built a modest following filming pranks and stunts together, and this particular video was conceived as the one that would push their channel into a much larger tier of viewership. The plan involved a Desert Eagle chambered in .50 caliber. The Desert Eagle is not a subtle firearm. It is one of the largest and most powerful semi-automatic handguns manufactured for civilian sale. The .50 caliber version fires a round that is, by handgun standards, enormous. It is a weapon associated in popular culture with extremity, which was presumably part of its appeal for a stunt designed to generate attention. The round it fires is designed to deliver substantial energy at the target. It is not a round that things survive easily. Ruiz's idea was that Perez would fire the Desert Eagle at a thick, hardcover encyclopedia that he would hold in front of his chest. He believed the book would stop the bullet. He believed this sincerely enough to stake his life on it. The encyclopedia he selected was large, dense, and heavy, the kind of reference volume built to contain thousands of pages of compressed information. To Ruiz, this volume of paper represented sufficient barrier. It did not. Paper, regardless of quantity or compression, does not stop a .50 caliber round fired from a Desert Eagle. The physics of ballistic penetration are not subject to revision based on confidence or optimism. A .50 caliber round traveling at the velocity produced by that weapon carries kinetic energy that paper cannot absorb, deflect, or meaningfully slow. Perez took aim. She fired. The round entered the front cover of the encyclopedia. It passed through the pages. It exited the back. It struck Pedro Ruiz III. The wound was immediately severe. Others present responded. Emergency services were contacted. Responders arrived at the scene in Minnesota and found Ruiz with a gunshot wound consistent with a .50 caliber round fired at close range. The injuries were severe. Transport was attempted or initiated. What medical teams encountered upon assessment was a wound that had inflicted damage beyond what intervention could address. Pedro Ruiz III was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a gunshot wound. Mona Lisa Perez was subsequently charged in connection with his death, ultimately pleading guilty to manslaughter and serving a jail sentence structured in short intervals so she could continue raising the couple's 2 young children. The YouTube video they had set out to make was never posted. Semi-auto Roulette, Texas. In the year 2000, a 19-year-old man in Houston, Texas, died at a party after attempting to play Russian roulette with the wrong kind of gun. The party was not an unusual gathering. People had come together in the way people do. The 19-year-old was among them. At some point during the evening, a semi-automatic handgun was produced. The decision was made to play Russian roulette. Russian roulette is a potentially fatal game built around a specific mechanical reality. A revolver holds its rounds in a rotating cylinder. When the cylinder contains 1 round and 5 empty chambers, spinning it and pulling the trigger creates a 1 in 6 chance of discharge. The game is dangerous by design. It is, at minimum, a game with comprehensible internal logic. The odds exist, the mechanism creates them, the player faces genuine chance. That logic depends entirely on using a revolver. A semi-automatic handgun does not function this way. A semi-automatic feeds rounds from a detachable magazine through a mechanism that strips the top cartridge from the stack and chambers it automatically each time the slide cycles. When a person racks the slide of a loaded semi-automatic, a live round enters the chamber. It stays there. It does not rotate away. It does not share the chamber with any probability of absence. The 19-year-old picked up the semi-automatic. He racked the slide. This action, performed perhaps with the intention of creating suspense or engaging in what he understood to be the ritual of the game, did exactly what it is mechanically designed to do. It placed a live round directly into the firing chamber. There was now a 100% chance the weapon would discharge when the trigger was pulled. He pulled the trigger. The weapon discharged. Other people at the party were present when this happened. Emergency services were contacted. Responders arrived at the location in Houston. The wound was assessed. The 19-year-old had been struck by a round fired at contact range. The nature of the injury was severe. Responders did what could be done. It was not enough. The 19-year-old was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound, ruled accidental. He had attempted to play a game of chance with a mechanism incapable of producing chance. The outcome was guaranteed from the moment he racked the slide. Firearms instructors who study fatal misunderstandings of this type note that the confusion between revolvers and semi-automatics is one of the most consistently recurring errors in accidental shooting deaths, precisely because the two platforms look similar enough to a casual observer while operating on entirely opposite mechanical principles. Courtroom demonstration death. In 1871, a defense lawyer named Clement Vallandigham shot himself in the stomach in his hotel room while demonstrating how the victim had accidentally killed himself and died the following day. Vallandigham was a prominent figure in Ohio legal and political circles. He had served in the United States Congress and had been a visible, sometimes controversial presence in public life during the Civil War era, having been arrested and briefly exiled by the Lincoln administration for speeches criticizing the war effort, a chapter of his career that had already made him a nationally recognized and divisive name years before this trial. By 1871, he was practicing law, and he had taken on the defense of a client accused of murder. The prosecution's case held that Vallandigham's client had killed the victim deliberately. Vallandigham's defense rested on a different theory, that the victim had shot himself accidentally in the process of drawing his own weapon while rising from a kneeling position, catching the hammer on his clothing. It was not an implausible argument. Accidental discharges during draws were documented occurrences, and if he could demonstrate the mechanism convincingly, he might create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury. He decided to demonstrate it to his defense team in his hotel room. Vallandigham obtained a pistol for the purpose. He intended to show physically invisibly how a man drawing a weapon from his pocket could inadvertently discharge it in the act of drawing. His hotel room was the venue, where he gathered fellow attorneys to show them precisely how the accident could have occurred. He had 2 pistols in his room, one loaded and one unloaded, and accidentally picked up the loaded weapon without rechecking it before performing the demonstration for his colleagues. Vallandigham took the pistol. He placed it in his pocket. He began his demonstration, narrating and performing the movements he argued the victim had made in the moments before the fatal shot. He reached into his pocket. He drew the weapon, pulling it upward and outward in imitation of a man drawing under pressure. The pistol discharged. The round entered Vallandigham's stomach. He had believed the weapon was unloaded. It was not. A live round had been present in the chamber, and the motion of the draw, replicated precisely as he argued the victim had performed it, caused the weapon to fire exactly as he was arguing it could fire. Medical attention was sought immediately. In 1871, abdominal gunshot wounds were not treatable in any meaningful sense by the standards of modern medicine. The surgical options available, the anesthetic options available, and the understanding of infection and internal injury were all severely limited compared to what would develop in the following century. A stomach wound in 1871 was in most cases a death sentence delivered at varying speeds. Vallandigham survived into the following day. He died from the wound on the day after he had shot himself during the demonstration. The cause of death was the gunshot wound to the abdomen he sustained during his own demonstration. His client, benefiting either from the demonstration itself or from the circumstances that followed, was acquitted, meaning the defense succeeded in the courtroom, even as it cost the defense attorney his own life to make the point. Magazine removed, still loaded. On January 23, 1978, Terry Kath, the lead guitarist of the rock band Chicago, shot himself in the head at a gathering in California after removing a Pistols magazine and concluding the weapon was empty. Terry Kath was 31 years old and had been one of the founding members of Chicago, a band that had achieved significant commercial success through the 1970s. Kath was considered by many who knew him and worked with him to be the band's most technically gifted musician, and Jimi Hendrix himself had reportedly praised his guitar playing. He was also known among people in his circle as someone with an enthusiasm for firearms. He owned multiple weapons and handled them regularly, and friends later recalled that this casual familiarity had bred a degree of overconfidence around guns that unsettled some of the people closest to him. The gathering on that January evening was social, a group of people at a residence in California. At some point during the evening, Kath began handling firearms. Some of those present expressed concern. Firearms at a social gathering, handled casually, made people uncomfortable, which is a reasonable response. Kath moved to reassure them. He picked up a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. To demonstrate that the weapon posed no danger, he performed what he understood to be the act of making it safe. He removed the detachable magazine and held it up, visible evidence that the ammunition supply had been separated from the weapon. He reportedly told the person nearest him not to worry, gesturing with the pistol as he spoke, treating the removal of the magazine as the final and sufficient safety step. What he did not check was the chamber. A semi-automatic pistol feeds rounds from a magazine into the firing chamber through a mechanical cycle. If a round had already been chambered before the magazine was removed, that round remained in the chamber after the magazine was gone. The magazine's removal stopped no further rounds from being cycled. It did not eject the round already seated and ready. There was a round in the chamber. With the magazine removed and the weapon in his hand, Kath pointed the muzzle at his own temple. He pulled the trigger. The weapon fired. The round that had been seated in the chamber discharged directly into his head. The people present at the gathering were witnesses to what followed. Emergency services were contacted. Responders arrived at the California residence and found Kath with a contact gunshot wound to the head. The nature of the wound was immediately apparent. There was no medical intervention that would have produced a different outcome. Terry Kath was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, ruled accidental. He had removed the magazine. He had left the round in the chamber. He had pointed the weapon at his own head to prove it was safe. His death is now cited routinely in firearms safety courses as the clearest possible illustration of why removing a magazine is never, by itself, sufficient to confirm a semi-automatic pistol is unloaded. Blank round skull fracture. On October 12, 1984, actor John Eric Hexum was fatally injured after pressing a prop revolver loaded with a blank cartridge against his right temple and pulling the trigger on the set of a television production in Los Angeles, dying 6 days later. Hexum was 26 years old and had been working as an actor in Hollywood for several years. He had appeared in television productions and was gaining visibility in the industry. In October of 1984, he was on the set of the television series Cover Up, a production that involved action sequences and, as a result, prop firearms. Prop firearms on film and television sets are real weapons modified or loaded specifically for production use. They can fire blank cartridges, which are rounds that contain propellant and a primer but no projectile. Blanks produce a flash, a sound, and a muzzle blast, sufficient to look convincing on camera. They are used in place of live ammunition to avoid putting actual projectiles into a production environment. Blanks are not harmless. On the day of the incident, filming had been delayed. The production was waiting. Hexum was on set in costume with the prop revolver, and the delay had stretched long enough that he had grown impatient. He began handling the revolver in an idle way. Crew members present later recalled that he had made a joking comment moments earlier about ending the tedium of the delay, spinning the cylinder as he said it, apparently unaware of how dangerous a blank could be at close contact with a human skull. He removed all but one of the blank cartridges from the cylinder. He spun the cylinder. He pressed the muzzle of the .44 Magnum revolver directly against his right temple. He pulled the trigger. The blank cartridge fired. There was no bullet. There was, however, an explosive discharge of propellant gases at the muzzle, delivered at contact range directly against his skull. At contact range, the concussive force of that discharge transmitted through the bone. His skull fractured. Bone fragments were driven inward into his brain. Crew members on the set of Cover Up responded immediately. Emergency services were contacted. Hexum was transported from the production location. He was placed on life support. The injuries to his brain were severe, a penetrating injury caused not by a bullet, but by bone driven inward by the force of a blank discharged at contact range. He remained on life support for 6 days. On October 18, 1984, Jan-Erik Hexum was declared brain dead. His organs were donated. The cause of his death was the skull fracture and resulting brain injury sustained when he pressed a prop revolver loaded with a blank cartridge against his temple and fired it. He was 26 years old. His death is widely credited with prompting the film and television industry to overhaul on-set firearm safety protocols, including mandatory minimum distances between blank-firing weapons and performers, and the requirement of a certified armorer on productions using prop guns. Prop Gun Ricochet, North Carolina. On March 31, 1993, actor Brandon Lee died on a film set in Wilmington, North Carolina, after a fragment of a dummy bullet lodged in a prop revolver's barrel was fired into his abdomen during the filming of a scene. Brandon Lee was 28 years old, the son of martial arts icon Bruce Lee, and was in the final weeks of filming a supernatural action film in which he played the lead role. The production, like many of its era, relied on prop revolvers modified to fire blank cartridges for scenes requiring gunfire, and separately used dummy cartridges, rounds with no propellant and no primer, built purely to look realistic in close-up shots, where the gun was not meant to fire at all. Days before the fatal scene, the production had filmed a close-up requiring dummy rounds visibly loaded in a revolver. Someone on the crew had improperly assembled a batch of those dummy cartridges, leaving the bullet's lead tip seated loosely enough that the primer, which should have been removed, remained active. When that revolver was later fired using only a blank cartridge for a separate scene, the propellant charge of the blank was enough to ignite the leftover primer and propel the lodged bullet tip a short distance down the barrel, where it stopped, invisible, undetected by the standard checks performed on set. Days later, that same revolver was loaded with a fresh blank for the scene in which Lee's character was to be shot at close range. No one on set was aware that a live projectile was already seated in the barrel from the earlier incident. When the blank was fired directly at Lee during the take, the propellant gases of the blank pushed the lodged fragment out of the muzzle with lethal force, essentially turning what everyone believed was a harmless blank discharge into a functioning gunshot. The fragment struck Lee in the abdomen. He collapsed on set. Crew members and emergency responders were called immediately, and he was rushed to a hospital in Wilmington, where surgeons worked for hours attempting to repair the internal damage. The injury proved too severe. Brandon Lee was pronounced dead at the hospital. The cause of death was a gunshot wound caused by a fragment of a dummy round that had lodged undetected in a prop firearm days earlier. The film he had been completing was released posthumously, and the incident, alongside Hexum's death 9 years earlier, became one of the two cases most frequently cited when the entertainment industry discusses the handling of firearms on set. Vest did not cover. In 2015, 19-year-old Miguel Martinez was shot and killed on a bike trail in California after allowing a friend to fire a weapon at him while he wore a protective vest, with the round striking above the vest's protective coverage area. Body armor is not a suit of invulnerability. It is an engineered product rated to specific performance standards. Most commonly, the standards set by the National Institute of Justice, which classify vests by the caliber and velocity of round they are certified to stop. A vest rated to stop a particular caliber of round will stop that round when the round strikes the panel designed to stop it. Change the caliber, change the angle, or change the point of impact, and the rating may no longer apply. Body armor is designed to protect specific zones of the body. The upper chest, lower neck, and shoulder areas near the top edge of a standard vest represent the boundary of its protection. Above that line, the vest provides nothing. This was not the understanding Martinez and his friend operated under on that day in 2015. The gathering was on a bike trail, an outdoor location. Martinez was 19. He put on the protective vest. His friend took aim at his chest. The premise of what they were doing was that the vest would absorb the round and Martinez would walk away from it. A demonstration of the vest's capability, or perhaps simply an act of confidence in a piece of equipment that neither of them fully understood. The friend fired. The round struck near the upper edge of the vest. At that point of impact, the protective panel did not cover the entry point. The bullet entered Martinez's chest above the vest's effective protection zone. The wound was immediately severe. Others who were present responded. Emergency services were contacted. Responders arrived at the bike trail location. They assessed Martinez's condition and found a gunshot wound to the chest, inflicted at close range. He was transported. Medical teams received him and assessed the injury. The wound had been delivered to an area of the chest that the vest was not designed to protect, and the damage was not something that could be reversed. Miguel Martinez was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the chest. He had been wearing body armor when he was shot. The armor was not positioned to save him. Cases like this one are now referenced by body armor manufacturers themselves in consumer warnings, which explicitly state that soft body armor is not tested or intended to be shot intentionally as a demonstration, regardless of certification level. Dog pulls, trigger. In 2023, 30-year-old Joseph Austin Smith was shot and killed in Kansas when a dog in the back seat of a pickup truck stepped on the trigger of a loaded rifle and fired a round through the front passenger seat where Smith was sitting. Hunting trips involve firearms. That is their nature. A pickup truck carrying hunters into the field will typically carry weapons, and those weapons will frequently be loaded because the purpose of the trip is to encounter and engage game, and encountering game does not always allow time to load a weapon in the moment. This is understood and accepted within hunting culture. The question is always where the weapon is placed and in what condition. Smith was 30 years old. He was in the front passenger seat of the pickup truck. The truck was in motion or stationary during a hunting trip in Kansas. In the backseat of that truck, two things shared the space: a loaded rifle and a dog. The rifle was not safe. A firearm safety mechanism, when engaged, prevents the trigger from functioning even when pressure is applied. When a safety is not engaged, the weapon is in a condition of immediate readiness. Any sufficient pressure on the trigger will fire it. The rifle on the back seat was in this condition. The dog moved. Dogs in vehicles move constantly. They shift their weight. They reposition. They respond to motion and sound and smell. In this case, the dog moved in a way that brought one of its paws into contact with the trigger guard area of the rifle. Sufficient pressure was applied to the trigger. The rifle discharged. The round traveled forward from the back seat. It passed through the material of the front passenger seat. It struck Joseph Austin Smith from behind. Other occupants of the vehicle responded. Emergency services were contacted. Responders arrived at the location in Kansas and assessed Smith's condition. A rifle round fired at close range through a vehicle seat delivers significant energy to whatever it strikes on the other side. The injuries were severe. What medical response was possible was initiated. It was not enough to change the outcome. Joseph Austin Smith was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a gunshot wound, ruled accidental. He had been on a hunting trip with a loaded, unsafe rifle resting in the back seat alongside a dog. In the aftermath, hunting safety organizations pointed to the case as part of a small but recurring category of accidental discharges caused by dogs, animals whose paws and body weight are entirely capable of applying the several pounds of trigger pressure most rifles require, and recommended that firearms in vehicles always be secured in a case or rack, rather than left loose on a seat. Lighter into barrel. Gregory David Prior was killed in Indiana when a muzzle-loading rifle he was attempting to inspect discharged directly into his face after he used a cigarette lighter to illuminate the inside of the barrel. Black powder muzzleloaders are a specific class of firearm with a long history in American shooting culture. They are loaded from the muzzle end, meaning the shooter pours a measured charge of black powder down the barrel, seats a projectile on top of it, and then fires the weapon through a separate ignition mechanism at the breech. They are slower to load and operate than modern firearms, and they have a specific failure mode that modern firearms do not: the misfire. A muzzleloader misfire occurs when the weapon fails to discharge despite being loaded and primed. The round and the powder charge remain in the barrel. The powder, which was not fully ignited, may still be present in the barrel, in a state that can be ignited by heat or open flame. This is a known hazard in black powder shooting. It is documented in the literature of the sport. The correct response to a muzzleloader misfire involves specific safety procedures designed to avoid any action that could ignite the residual powder, including pointing the muzzle in a safe direction, waiting a full period of time in case of a delayed ignition, and using a dedicated discharging tool rather than any open flame anywhere near the barrel. Prior's .54 caliber muzzleloader had misfired. He wanted to see inside the barrel to determine whether there was a clog or obstruction. The inside of a rifle barrel is dark. He needed light. He pointed the muzzle of the misfired, loaded, powder-containing weapon toward his face. He produced a cigarette lighter. He flicked it at the muzzle opening. The open flame reached the barrel. Unburned black powder residue inside the barrel ignited. The weapon discharged. The round it still contained, along with the force of the ignited powder charge, traveled the length of the barrel and exited the muzzle directly into Gregory David Prior's face. The discharge at that range and in that configuration inflicted severe injuries. Emergency services were contacted and responders arrived. The nature of a point-blank muzzleloader discharge directed into a person's face presented responders with injuries that were beyond what field intervention or transport and hospital care could address. Gregory David Prior was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the face resulting from the accidental discharge of a black powder muzzle loader triggered when an open flame was introduced to the muzzle of a loaded weapon. Muzzle loading associations now cite the case explicitly in their published safety literature, listing an open flame near the muzzle as one of the specific actions a shooter must never take when troubleshooting a misfire. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.